The other day I was in my car and it started to fog up from my breathing. And I remember thinking how it's almost like how our own voice in our own head, always talking, fogs up our brain cells. If you can imagine, there's a little mouth inside each brain cell, and it's always talking. Then there's fog on the walls of the brain cell. And if it's foggy, then the brain can't actually see. So even just being in my car for the last while and talking, it's starting to fog up, and it becomes harder to see out the windows. And so by talking in our head all the time, we're fogging up our brains. And then I got an email from Jamie Wheel from Flow Genome Project, and him and Stephen Kotler have written a new book. Something about fire. I can't remember the title. But with a pre-order, then there might be some weekly Facebook sessions with them or something. So I pre-ordered it because I'm curious about what they have to say. And I kind of want to ask them about this whole supposed mental illness side of things. But they're saying they're recruiting pyromaniacs, and that's sort of their little term they're using. And again, they're using maniac in a positive light. And I was thinking about how I was calling it shamania at one point. And it's almost like I'm a shamaniac, or at least a she-maniac. And in his email, he mentioned that there's a $4 trillion revolution where people are spending money and time searching for new and novel ways to hack our consciousness, enter flow, and change the world. And I feel like with map consciousness and trans consciousness, we don't hack flow. We are thrown into flow. And we don't have to do anything to get there. So again, there's this gap between people that don't have to do anything to get there and would prefer not to go there, and people who are trying so hard to get there. And I just don't understand why there's probably $4 trillion being spent medicating people who go there, who don't want to go there, and then the other half are spending $4 trillion to try to get there. It just blows my mind. I feel like if more effort was spent helping people who go there to stabilize in that, then that would change the energy of the world such that that world would become more manifest for other people to get to go there too. There's a war on this type of consciousness on one end, and then they're selling it to people on the other end. And a person doesn't have to spend a single dollar. The universe can put us into flow. And usually it happens when we let go. So no amount of striving and trying is going to get us there. It only gets us there in as much as we try so hard that we eventually give up. And that's the thing with trauma and suffering, that some people just give up. And then that's when this element of consciousness comes in order to save that person's life. And I listened to the talk by Michael Stone, and he talks about heart and meaning. He was talking about in the context of work, but I feel like heart and meaning need to be restored in the context of mental illness, because it's just seen as a meaningless mental illness, and that there's something wrong with people. And I feel it actually connects a person with their heart and meaning, and they see the world's meaningless, it drives them crazy, and then they're called mentally ill. And Michael Stone also talked about reauthoring the story of your life. And I would also say it's about reauthoring perception, giving different voice to perception, and then we're always able to say new things. And then why does one need a story? When we see meaning everywhere, every when, every moment, we don't ask what the meaning of life is. And that can only happen with clear perception. And clear perception can only happen by always dropping perceptions once they arise in consciousness. Because the tendency can be, when one starts to have a couple of clear perceptions, one can really try to hold tightly to them because they feel so true and rich and meaningful. One might hold tightly to one and spend a lot of time actually on that story. But when one can actually surrender those perceptions, one sees that that never ends. And the thing with this seeing is it doesn't take practice. Because we have eyes. We can see. So all this stuff about practice this and practice that, there's no meaning. Because the one who practices creates a pattern. And any pattern we create causes a form of tunnel vision or blindness. And Michael Stone talked about 3 blind spots. And I was thinking to myself, get rid of the word 3 and get rid of the word spot, and you just have blind, and that kind of sums it up. I don't think we have blind spots. I think we're mostly blind, and we have a spot of perception that isn't perception at all. And he was talking about the myth of separation, and I feel like in mania we have a state of oneness, and that's why we act. We have to act because we're not separate. So whether we're separate or not is indicated by our actions and our gestures. So the universe knows by way of our gestures whether we're one or whether we're separate. And that's, again, everything is recorded in the field of the universe and affects everything else. And he said we need to transform our speaking and listening to change how others see us. And he was talking about this community listening field thing. And he's talking about that in terms of his work. But I feel that is so pertinent for people that are called mental patients, as we need to transform our speaking and listening to change how others see us. And he also said use the power of the blow. So in martial arts, they use the power of the attack to neutralize the attack and to move. And I need to think about that one more. And he also said transform the way the community sees, hears, and holds you. And people who go into these states need to be held differently. They need to be seen differently. They need to be heard differently. And that's part of bringing ECPR here, is they're going to be held and be held differently. And that's all the stuff I was talking about recently with the light coming out of one's eyes, and how one is looked at is what changes them. And he talked about when we're shunned, or when monkeys are shunned at a young age, they display aberrant and antisocial behavior. And I feel like part of what happens in map consciousness is when we go from ego consciousness to map consciousness, we are kind of shunned from the collective consensus world. And that, when it lasts long enough, can produce this aberrant and antisocial behavior sometimes, especially when one is moving back towards that dissonant field of thought and reality that we used to be a part of. But I feel like if more of us were there together, we wouldn't necessarily be isolated and have the gestures move towards those more antisocial bits. We almost need to move back towards being antisocial in order to reintegrate into the society, in order for them to kind of take us back. Because they can't take us back as enlightened people because they don't see us that way and they don't understand it. So that interpretation is one of the only ways we can actually reconnect with the field of reality. So again, watch what people in flow are wishing for. because if you flow too far, you might have to come back as a mental patient. And I also feel like the universe is trying to shun us and shunt us into the universe in order for us to live a totally different way. But when we can't stay there, when we can't remain in that energy and continue to act and live in that way, we need to react in a way that will get society to sort of reconnect us with it. But it's done in a very rude way. And he talked about a story field, but I feel like we could live in a perception field instead of a field of all these stories. We could be living in a field of perception, of vision, of seeing and acting on that instead of talking about stories. And he talked about a course he's going to be doing, coaching people, and he talked about a transformational project where you need the help of other people in order to do it. And I was thinking that this whole map consciousness, this whole trans consciousness, this whole energy of the universe is a transformational project of the universe. We need to work together. We can't do it by ourselves. We're all a different piece of the puzzle. And he shared a powerful story that is again illustrating exactly what I was talking about the other day. And I find it fascinating how I unfold these concepts related to my experience and what I see and mental health and being labeled and how it's not really that. And then a few days later, whatever it is I'm exploring for the day, and I don't really intake that much information of other people, but whatever it is, it's always exactly what I was talking about. And he shared this story of how he had a troubled past and he got into a lot of trouble. But then years later, 10, 20 years later or something, he had studied with all these high-level people and he'd gotten to this really great place in his life. And then he ended up meeting up with an old friend from the past and going to this party of sorts. And he realized he was all of a sudden feeling like having a drink or having sex or so many of these things that he no longer participated in. And he said something very profound. He said that he realized that he was relating to a field of people that know him as something other than he knows himself as. So he said, I'm relating to a field of people that know me as something other than I know myself. And he said, that's the power of the community field. And that's exactly what I'm talking about with this putting ourselves in the eyes of pathologizing people. Deep down inside, we know that that's not the truth about us. It's not the entire truth. It's a very small fraction of the truth, or it's none of the truth. So this is saying that he was in a room of people who saw him as something else. They saw him as a different person because they knew him years ago. And those perceptions were being projected onto him, and that was changing his pattern of behavior, or at least his thoughts of how he wanted to behave. And that's exactly what happens with putting oneself in front of a psychiatrist, for example. We could be feeling good, but then we have to go play the role of mental patient, and then that's going to warp that trajectory. It's something other than we know ourselves. But the trouble is, a lot of times we actually believe that, and we start to actually believe that's what's true of ourselves, and it's so dangerous. So if this guy would have thought, this is who I am because I'm feeling like I want to drink and all that, and then gone down that path, but he realized it was the perceptions of other people and the energy of other people projecting things on him. So that's the power of the community field. So in a way, it would be amazing to be able to level up the community listening field of people that are labeled, so we can listen to something else than this crappy story about mental illness. And then we can see ourselves in different ways, and we can see ourselves in different ways together. And it also is related to acting altruistic, because that will change the perceptions of us as people, because we connected with our altruism, but then we're medicated back to egocentrism. So the community field of mental illness needs to be changed. And I've definitely changed my own community listening field. And I've talked about how I feel. That has helped me. So I really am feeling now that it's so important to not put myself in that view. And if I don't at all, maybe those perceptions, and I won't be warped in that way by other people's perceptions, and maybe that will dry up. Bye-bye for now. I'm still at the park and it's getting dark. And I edited my video and I saw a couple things that I wanted to talk about just to add to the second video. And one of the things was related to how I was talking about wanting, and how wanting is based on thought and thought is based on programming. So when we want like that wanting something in particular is getting in the way of seeing the infinity of what is there in front of us and being able to be choicelessly aware of it and be drawn to something each moment. So by wanting in a particular way, we're not being drawn. We're not drawing. We're not drawing with our eyes and always creating a new picture because we're wanting this something in particular. And when we can't see in this way of constantly drawing and seeing relationships and extrapolating, we're not understanding. And when we're not understanding, it's not just that's when we want, it's when we're not understanding, we don't have that energy, because energy is from understanding and seeing and perception, which is light causing the image sound of perception. And when we have our wanting sounds in the way, we can't see. So we don't have the energy. And when we don't have that energy, then we want pleasure, which is a substitute for that energy. And so we're just addicted to what we want. And that is very machine-like. And I was also thinking about what Jason Silva talked about with changing the past, and how if we reframe our story, we change the past. And I was actually thinking about how in my first experience of map consciousness, of trans consciousness, of that magic and mystery, I felt it was very spiritual and magical and mysterious. And then I got to the psych ward and they told me that I had a mental illness, and then that is supposed to write over what happened. So my label, my diagnosis, did change the past. It changed the past from something vast and expansive and completely awe-inspiring, even though there was a lot of pain at the end, into this trajectory of mental illness. So it transformed the immeasurable and the wonder into this storyline of a chemical imbalance. And the chemical imbalance is to maintain the status quo. So the chemical imbalance of one's individual brain is a way to explain away something so vast that could change society. And it keeps the current balance of the status quo. So it changes infinity into mental illness, and it changes the past. And so I'm going to rewrite over that past again and go back to the vast. And again, the infinity of that light and of that dimension is all condensed into this sound, these memes, these stories of mental illness, which are just sound. And believing those sounds warps our vision, so we can't see that vastness as that again, because we'll always be interpreting it in terms of this new past that we've been given, which is that was all mental illness. So now all that vastness that happened is all evidence to further inform what to look out for next time, because it's mental illness. So it rewrites over the past and uses that past against us in the future, instead of using that as a springboard into the blueprint of the visions that we saw and experienced, and the vastness of what it means to be human. So we have this experience and it changes us, but then we get turned into a mental patient, which changes us again. We need to change back. We need to take our subjective experience back and take it future and make it future and allow us to have that trajectory again and ability to unfold that vision and have that vision and not be made mentally ill by it and not become labeled because of it. It's just sensitivity of perception. And I was also thinking about how each of us is an ego, and we are moving about in our patterned ways. We go to work, we come home, and we take this street, and people take that street, and it's all this perfectly orchestrated dance of egoic consciousness, and people doing what they need to do to survive and moving up the ladder, and etc., etc. And then if somebody, through the volition of the universe, gets access to trans consciousness or map consciousness, now all of a sudden they're not moving in that way, and they're actually disrupting this ego orchestra. And so when that ego orchestra gets disrupted, egos as part of the orchestra get alerted, and they're like, who is this disrupting the orchestra? And so they have this other holding pattern for those people through medication and all that stuff that happens to put them there, so then this other orchestra can continue, because the other person's going here and there, and they're totally disrupting this ego orchestra that is vastly out of tune, but nobody can hear that. And I'm wondering if this journey of some randomness is sort of like putting possibility in front of me, and if it increases the probability of synchronizing, which is synchronizing perception. It's sort of like fishing for synchronicity, and the art of gathering consciousness.